Good evening and welcome back to the archive. The great oak doors have been locked for the night, their heavy brass keys turned with the same ceremony our predecessors have observed for centuries. The public tours have ended, the casual visitors have departed, and now we have the silence we cherish. Just you and I, and the whispered secrets of 1,000 forgotten follies. Tonight, I invite you to join me in a particularly shadowed wing of our collection, where the air still seems to carry the weight of medieval incense and something far more unsettling. I have pulled from the deepest recesses of our stacks a folio bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age and marked by the careful marginalia of scholars who studied these events with a mixture of fascination and horror. This exhibit documents what happens when fear meets faith, when panic becomes prayer, and when an entire civilization decides that the only way to appease an angry God is through blood. The file bears a simple label in faded ink, the Flagellant Mania, a study in collective madness. Before we open this particular specimen to examination, I should mention if you find a strange sort of comfort in these quiet explorations of humanity's most bewildering chapters, you're welcome to subscribe to our archive. It ensures you'll receive word whenever we unlock a new wing for our trusted members. There's something oddly soothing about learning that our ancestors, for all their apparent wisdom, were just as capable of spectacular misjudgment as we are today. Now then, let us begin. Case File 1. The Grand Delusion, the Brotherhood of the Lash. Picture, if you will, the Europe of 1348. The morning mist rises from cobblestone streets that have known centuries of measured footsteps, of merchants hawking their wares, of children playing in the shadows of great cathedrals. But on this particular autumn morning, something is different. The streets are too quiet, the market stalls stand empty, and from behind shuttered windows comes a sound that shouldn't exist in a civilized world, the rhythmic crack of leather against flesh, accompanied by voices raised not in celebration, but in desperate, keening prayer. This is our first specimen from the collection, the great flagellant movement of the 14th century, a phenomenon so bizarre that even contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe it without sounding as though they were documenting the fever dreams of madmen. To understand this particular folly, we must first appreciate the canvas upon which it was painted. The Black Death had arrived in Europe like a thief in the night, stealing not just individual lives, but entire ways of understanding the world. In some regions, half the population simply vanished. Villages that had thrived for generations became graveyards. The very foundations of medieval society, the church, the feudal system, the carefully ordered hierarchy that gave life meaning, all of it seemed as fragile as parchment in a flame. Into this void stepped a most peculiar solution. If God was angry, and surely only divine wrath could explain such suffering, then perhaps God could be appeased. Not through prayer alone, not through good works or charitable giving, but through pain, through blood, through the deliberate mortification of the flesh in the most public, most spectacular way imaginable. The movement began in the German regions, though pinpointing its exact origins is like trying to identify the first raindrop in a storm. What we know from the careful records kept by bewildered monks is that sometime in 1348, groups of men began appearing in towns across the Holy Roman Empire. They called themselves flagellants, from the Latin flagellum, meaning whip, though they preferred more grandiose titles. The Brethren of the Cross, the Brotherhood of the Lash, the Company of Divine Mercy. These were not, it's important to note, the usual suspects for religious extremism. Many were prosperous merchants, skilled craftsmen, even minor nobility. They had families, businesses, reputations to maintain. And yet, something in the air of that plague-haunted year had convinced them that the path to salvation lay through a very specific ritual of self-torture. The ceremony itself was both rigidly structured and wildly theatrical. A company of flagellants, typically 33 members, in honor of Christ's earthly years, would process into a town singing hymns of penitence. They wore long white robes marked with red crosses, and each carried a scourge crafted with disturbing attention to detail. These were not simple whips, but carefully engineered instruments of pain, often embedded with iron spikes or shards of glass, designed to draw blood with maximum efficiency. The ritual required them to strip to the waist and arrange themselves in a circle in the town square or before the local church. What followed was a carefully choreographed display of synchronized self-mutilation that could last for hours. They would strike themselves across the back and shoulders while chanting specific prayers, the rhythm of the lashes keeping time with their devotions. The goal was not merely pain, but visible suffering blood that would flow freely, wounds that would mark their bodies as instruments of divine appeasement. But here's where our exhibit becomes truly fascinating from an archival perspective. This wasn't spontaneous madness. The Flagellants had developed an entire bureaucracy of suffering. They elected leaders called masters, who oversaw the rituals and maintained discipline within the group. They created elaborate rules governing everything from the proper technique for self-flagellation to the acceptable level of bloodshed required for spiritual efficacy. They had, in essence, systematized insanity. The movement spread with remarkable speed across medieval Europe. From the German states, it leaped the Alps into northern Italy, where entire cities would shut down when a company of flagellants arrived. It moved west into France, where it acquired local variations and theological refinements. Within months, thousands upon thousands of people had abandoned their normal lives to join what they genuinely believed was humanity's last hope for divine forgiveness. The chronicler Henry of Hereford, whose account forms one of our most detailed sources, described watching a group of flagellants perform their ritual in the cathedral square of his city. He wrote, and I quote from his original Latin, that the sight was both pitiable and terrifying. For these men seemed possessed not by demons, but by a strange and terrible love of God that manifested itself in the destruction of their own flesh. What strikes me most, reading through these yellowed accounts in the quiet of the archive, is how utterly convinced the participants were of their righteousness. This wasn't the desperate act of broken individuals, but a coordinated movement led by intelligent, articulate people who had developed sophisticated theological justifications for their behavior. They argued that Christ's suffering on the cross had been insufficient to wash away the sins of humanity, a position that would have been considered deeply heretical in normal times. Therefore, they reasoned, additional suffering was required. They were, in their minds, completing Christ's work through their own blood and pain. They were saving the world, one lash at a time. The movement's theology was elaborate, and within its own twisted logic, remarkably coherent. The flagellants believed that 33.5 days of ritual self-torture could wash away all sins, both their own and those of their communities. They claimed direct communication with angels, who had supposedly revealed to them the exact requirements for appeasing God's wrath against the plague. Some groups went further, developing complex numerological systems that dictated precisely how many lashes were required for different categories of sign. Adultery might require 100 strokes. Theft might demand 300. Murder required special attention that could take days to properly address. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this particular exhibit in human folly was how eagerly it was embraced by the communities the flagellants visited. Town officials would often declare holidays when a company arrived. Churches would open their doors for extended ceremonies. Ordinary citizens would line the streets to watch the rituals, many weeping openly at the sight of so much voluntary suffering undertaken on their behalf. The psychological mechanisms at work here are as fascinating as they are troubling. Medieval Europe was a society that understood suffering as inherently meaningful. Christ had suffered for humanity's sins, saints had suffered for their faith, and ordinary people were expected to endure hardship as a test of spiritual worthiness. The Flagellants simply took this cultural foundation and amplified it to an extreme that, in retrospect, seems almost inevitable. They offered something that traditional religious authorities could not: immediate, visible, dramatic action in the face of incomprehensible catastrophe. Where priests could only offer prayers and promises of eventual salvation, the Flagellants offered blood in the here and now. Where the Church spoke in abstract theological terms about sin and redemption, the Flagellants provided a literal, visceral demonstration of penitence that anyone could witness and understand. For a brief, mad moment in European history, they convinced entire regions that the path to salvation lay through spectacularly visible self-destruction. The movement reached its peak in the winter of 1348 to 1349, when companies of Flagellants numbered in the thousands and could be found in virtually every major city from the Rhine to the Po. They had developed their own songs, their own literature, their own systems of governance. Some historians suggest that at its height, the movement may have included as many as 500,000 active participants across Europe. But like many manias documented in our archives, the Flagellant movement contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very extremism that made it compelling also made it unsustainable. The wounds inflicted by their elaborate scourges often became infected. The constant travel and exposure weakened participants' resistance to the very plague they were trying to appease. And the theological claims they made, particularly their assertion that their suffering could replace traditional sacraments, inevitably brought them into conflict with church authorities who had initially tolerated or even encouraged their activities. By 1350, Pope Clement VI had officially condemned the movement as heretical. Local bishops, initially sympathetic to any display of religious devotion in such troubled times, began to recognize the challenge the Flagellants posed to traditional church authority. Secular rulers, concerned about large groups of religious zealots moving freely through their territories, started issuing edicts against the practice. But perhaps most damning of all, the plague continued. Despite months of spectacular public penance, despite rivers of voluntarily shed blood, despite the most dramatic displays of collective repentance in European history, people kept dying. The Black Death ground on with pitiless efficiency, indifferent to human suffering, whether inflicted by disease or by choice. The grand delusion began to crack. What remains in our collection from this extraordinary episode are not just the chronicler's accounts and papal condemnations, but the physical artifacts of the movement itself. We have examples of the scourges they used, surprisingly sophisticated implements that speak to the care with which they approached their self-destruction. We have fragments of their hymns, written in vernacular languages rather than Latin, suggesting they were meant for ordinary people rather than scholarly theologians. We have even a few blood-stained robes, preserved by some unknown medieval collector who recognized the historical significance of these relics of mass delusion. But most telling, perhaps, are the later writings of former Flagellants who lived long enough to record their experiences. These accounts, discovered in monastery libraries and private collections, reveal men struggling to understand how they had been convinced to abandon everything they valued for the sake of public self-torture. One anonymous manuscript, found in a German monastery and dating to the 1360s, contains this remarkable confession. We believed ourselves to be God's chosen instruments, purifying the world through our blood. We saw angels in our pain and heard the voice of Christ in our hymns. But when I look back now, I see only the madness of desperate men who had forgotten that God's mercy does not require human blood, only human hearts turned toward righteousness. And so concludes our first case file, The Grand Delusion of the Flagellant Movement, a specimen that demonstrates how even the most elaborate spiritual solutions can become, in the harsh light of historical analysis, simply another example of humanity's boundless capacity for well-intentioned error. But our folio contains more specimens yet. The movement that swept across Europe was sustained by individuals, each carrying their own particular version of the collective madness. Some of these personal stories are even more extraordinary than the broader phenomenon they helped create. Let us turn now to a different section of our archive, where individual folly takes center stage. Case File 2. The Personal Folly, the Divine Delusions of Konrad Schmid. Let us leave now the great hall, where we keep records of mass movements and collective manias, and turn our attention to a more intimate chamber, one dedicated to the particular follies of individuals who believed themselves chosen by forces beyond human understanding. Here, filed under the name Schmid Konrad, we find a specimen that illustrates how personal ambition and spiritual delusion can combine to create something far more dangerous than simple madness. Konrad Schmid was, by all contemporary accounts, an unremarkable man living in the unremarkable Bavarian town of Nordhausen in the year 1348. A master craftsman, some sources suggest he worked in leather, others in metalwork. He possessed the kind of solid, middle-class respectability that formed the backbone of medieval German society. He had a wife, children, a workshop that provided steady income, and a reputation for honest dealing that had taken years to establish. He was, in short, precisely the sort of person one would least expect to declare himself a living god. But the Black Death had a way of revealing hidden depths in the most ordinary souls, and Konrad Schmid discovered within himself a capacity for religious extremism that surprised even his closest associates. When the first company of flagellants arrived in Nordhausen in the autumn of 1348, Schmid was among the earliest converts to their cause. What we know of his initial involvement comes from the meticulous records kept by Brother Heinrich of the local Franciscan monastery, a man whose natural skepticism makes him an invaluable source for our collection. Heinrich recorded that Schmid initially impressed the flagellant company with his dedication to their rituals. Where others might perform their prescribed lashes with reluctance or theatrical flourish, Schmid approached the task with the methodical precision of a craftsman completing a difficult commission. He scourged himself, Heinrich wrote, with the same care he once applied to his leather work, counting each stroke and ensuring that no portion of his back and shoulders escaped attention. His devotion was both admirable and disturbing to witness. But devotion, as our archives demonstrate time and again, can curdle into something far more dangerous when it encounters an ambitious mind. Within weeks of joining the flagellants, Schmid began to experience what he claimed were direct communications from the divine. These were not the vague spiritual insights that many flagellants reported, but specific, detailed instructions that grew increasingly grandiose with each supposed revelation. The first claimed communication, according to testimony recorded during his later trial, was relatively modest. An angel had supposedly appeared to him during a particularly intense session of self-flagellation and informed him that his suffering was especially pleasing to God. The angel had, Schmid claimed, shown him visions of the celestial hierarchy and explained that his mortal torment was helping to balance the scales of cosmic justice. Now, such claims were not uncommon among the flagellants. Many reported mystical experiences during their rituals, hardly surprising, given the combination of physical trauma, religious fervor, and mob psychology involved in their practices. What made Schmid different was his systematic approach to building upon these initial visions. A craftsman by trade and temperament, he began to construct an elaborate theological framework around his supposed divine communications. He developed detailed charts showing the precise number of lashes required to absolve specific sins. He created complex prayers that he claimed had been dictated to him by archangels. He even designed modified scourges that would, he insisted, produce spiritually superior wounds. The other flagellants in his company initially welcomed these innovations. In a movement built around the idea of earning divine favor through suffering, someone who claimed direct angelic instruction was a valuable asset. Schmid quickly rose through the informal hierarchy of the group, eventually being elected as one of their masters, a position that gave him authority over the ritual practices of dozens of fellow penitents. But authority, as so many specimens in our collection demonstrate, has a way of feeding upon itself. By the winter of 1349, Schmid's claimed revelations had grown exponentially in scope and ambition. No longer content with angelic communications, he began to report direct conversations with Christ himself. These conversations, he told his increasingly devoted followers, had revealed to him humanity's true spiritual situation. The traditional church, Schmid announced, had been corrupted beyond redemption. A pope in Avignon was in league with demonic forces. The local clergy were spiritual frauds whose sacraments carried no divine power. Only through the Flagellant movement, and specifically through Schmid's divinely inspired leadership, could souls achieve true salvation. This was dangerous ground, theologically speaking. The Flagellant movement had always existed in tension with church authority, but Schmid was pushing far beyond the boundaries of acceptable dissent. Yet his followers, intoxicated by the combination of physical extremism and spiritual exclusivity, embraced these teachings with frightening enthusiasm. The records from this period, preserved in both ecclesiastical and secular archives, paint a picture of a man systematically constructing a personality cult around his claimed divine status. Schmid began to demand special reverence from his followers. They were required to kiss his hands before and after flagellation sessions. They had to seek his permission before making any significant decisions. Most tellingly, they were instructed to confess their sins to him rather than to ordained priests, a practice that struck at the very heart of Catholic doctrine. But Schmid's masterstroke, if we can call such destructive, delusion by that name, came in the spring of 1349 when he announced the ultimate revelation. During what he claimed was a 3-day mystical trance, Christ had supposedly appeared to him not as a teacher or guide, but as an equal. The divine nature that had once been embodied in Jesus of Nazareth had now, Schmid declared, taken up residence in Konrad Schmid of Nordhausen. He informed his stunned followers, the second coming made flesh. The psychological mechanisms at work here are as fascinating as they are tragic. Schmid seems to have genuinely believed his own claims, a common phenomenon in the specimens we study, where repeated self-deception eventually becomes indistinguishable from sincere conviction. The combination of sleep deprivation from constant travel, physical trauma from daily flagellation, the intoxicating effects of leadership, and the desperate spiritual hunger of plague-ravaged Europe had created perfect conditions for such delusions to flourish. His followers, many of whom had already sacrificed everything to join the Flagellant movement, found themselves faced with an impossible choice: admit that they had been following a madman and lose the spiritual certainty that had become their anchor in chaotic times, or double down on their commitment and accept that they were in the presence of divinity itself. Tragically, many chose the latter path. Word of Schmid's claims spread quickly through the network of flagellant companies operating across the German regions. Some groups rejected his teachings outright, recognizing them as dangerous blasphemy. Others split into factions, with heated theological debates conducted while performing their daily rituals of self-mortification. But a disturbing number of flagellants, particularly those who had known Schmid during his rise to leadership, accepted his divine claims without question. The company under Schmid's direct control swelled to over 200 members by the summer of 1349. They developed increasingly elaborate rituals, centered around worship of their living God. Schmid would preside over flagellation sessions from a raised platform, offering blessings and pronouncing absolutions. He claimed the power to cure diseases through touch, a particularly potent claim during a plague outbreak. Most dangerously, he began to prophesy that the end times were at hand, and that only those who followed him would survive the coming apocalypse. The secular and religious authorities could not, of course, allow such claims to go unchallenged. Pope Clement VI's condemnation of the flagellant movement in October 1349 specifically mentioned those who claimed divine authority as particular targets for suppression. Local bishops were instructed to identify and arrest anyone making blasphemous claims about their own spiritual status. Konrad Schmid's name began to appear in official correspondence between church authorities as early as November 1349. The Bishop of Mainz described him as a craftsman turned prophet who leads souls to damnation through claims of divinity. The papal legate Heinrich of Cologne wrote that Schmid represented the ultimate corruption of what began as simple penitence, but has become the worship of false gods. But Schmid had prepared for persecution. He taught his followers that opposition from church authorities was proof of their spiritual authenticity. After all, had not Christ himself been rejected by the religious establishment of his time? Arrest warrants and condemnations only served to reinforce his followers' belief that they were part of a cosmic drama in which they played the roles of the righteous remnant. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. In December 1349, a combined force of church officials and secular authorities surrounded Schmid's company while they were conducting a winter solstice ceremony in a forest outside Nordhausen. The living God, who had claimed power over life and death, was captured without resistance, along with most of his inner circle. The trial that followed was meticulously documented. These records form some of our most detailed sources for understanding not just Schmid's claims, but the psychological dynamics of his movement. The transcripts, written in Latin, but occasionally preserving Schmid's own words in vernacular German, reveal a man who maintained his divine claims even when faced with certain death. When asked by his ecclesiastical judges to recant his blasphemous teachings, Schmid reportedly replied, "You ask me to deny what I know to be true through direct revelation. Would you ask the sun to deny its light, or the ocean to deny its depths? I am what God has made me, and no earthly authority can change that divine reality." Even more revealing are the testimonies of his followers, many of whom were offered clemency in exchange for cooperation with the investigation. Their accounts paint a picture of a man who had become so completely identified with his delusions that he seemed genuinely puzzled by the authorities' refusal to accept his claims. Several witnesses reported that Schmid continued to bless people and offer spiritual counsel right up until the morning of his execution, apparently convinced that divine intervention would save him at the last moment. The sentence, handed down in February 1350, was death by burning, the standard punishment for unrepentant heretics. The execution took place in the main square of Nordhausen, in front of a crowd that included many former followers who had come to witness the end of their self-proclaimed savior. Contemporary accounts of the execution itself make for sobering reading. Brother Heinrich, who witnessed the event, wrote that Schmid maintained his divine claims even as the flames began to rise around the stake. He called upon his followers to remember his teachings and promised to return within 3 days to establish his kingdom on earth. He did not, of course, return. What makes Konrad Schmid's story particularly poignant for our collection is not just the spectacular nature of his delusions, but the very human needs they reveal. Here was a man who had lived an ordinary life until extraordinary circumstances convinced him that ordinariness was no longer sufficient. The plague had shattered all familiar certainties, and in that void, the possibility of divine specialness became irresistibly attractive. His followers, too, were responding to genuine spiritual hunger. In a world where traditional authorities had proven powerless against catastrophe, the promise of direct divine leadership offered something that conventional religion could not: immediate, personal access to cosmic purpose and meaning. The tragedy is not that they sought such meaning, but that they found it in the delusions of a craftsman who had mistaken the intensity of his own spiritual experience for evidence of divine election. The aftermath of Schmid's execution effectively ended the most extreme phase of the Flagellant movement in the German regions. Many of his followers, shaken by their leader's very mortal death, abandoned the movement entirely. Others joined more moderate Flagellant companies that focused on penitence without claims of special revelation. A few, according to Inquisition records, went underground, and continued to venerate Schmid's memory as a martyred prophet, though these groups seem to have faded away within a generation. What remains, filed carefully in our archives, is the testimony to one man's journey from respectable craftsman to self-proclaimed deity to ashes in a public square. It's a specimen that illuminates both the terrible vulnerability of human psychology under extreme stress and the dangerous seductiveness of believing oneself chosen by forces beyond ordinary understanding. In the margins of Brother Heinrich's chronicle, written years after these events, we find this reflection. Konrad Schmid was not an evil man, but a man driven to evil by his inability to accept that suffering, even the most extreme suffering, does not automatically confer spiritual authority. He confused the intensity of his experience with the validity of his interpretations, and in doing so, led dozens of souls into the darkness of delusion. And so we close this particular case file, The Personal Folly of Konrad Schmid, a reminder that the line between religious devotion and dangerous delusion can be surprisingly thin, especially when ordinary people find themselves living through extraordinary times. But our investigation is far from complete. The movement that produced both mass hysteria and individual megalomania also generated innovations in the technology of suffering instruments and techniques that reveal the disturbing ingenuity humans can apply to the problem of inflicting pain upon themselves. Let us move now to yet another wing of our archive, where the physical artifacts of this medieval mania await our examination. Case File 3, The Technological Blunder, the Perfected Art of the Flagrum. Here, in this particular wing of our archive, we house artifacts rather than manuscripts. The air carries a different quality heavier somehow, weighted with the presence of objects that once served purposes their creators never fully understood. Behind these glass cases lie the tools of medieval devotion, and tonight I invite you to examine perhaps the most disturbing example of human ingenuity applied to the problem of systematic self-destruction. This is a flagrum, one of several dozen examples in our collection, each representing a different regional variation on the theme of perfected suffering. To the untrained eye, it might appear to be simply a whip, crude and barbaric in its construction. But look closer, and you begin to appreciate the unsettling sophistication that went into its design. This particular specimen comes to us from a monastery in Bavaria, where it was discovered in the 1890s, still bearing traces of what laboratory analysis confirmed to be human blood. The word flagrum comes from the Latin, though medieval craftsmen developed their own vernacular terms that reveal much about how these implements were conceived. In German regions, they were called Giselle, a word that carried connotations not just of punishment, but of divine instruction. In French territories, they were known as disciplines, emphasizing their role as tools of spiritual education rather than mere torture devices. What makes these artifacts so remarkable and so disturbing is the evident care that went into their construction. This was not crude brutality, but applied engineering focused on achieving maximum spiritual efficacy through optimal physical trauma. The makers of these instruments understood human anatomy with uncomfortable precision, designing their tools to inflict pain without causing immediately fatal injuries. The basic structure was deceptively simple. A wooden handle, typically 12 to 18 inches in length, to which were attached multiple leather thongs or chains. But the sophistication lay in the details, each element refined through what we can only assume was extensive and horrifying experimentation. The handles themselves reveal the first layer of technological innovation. Craftsmen discovered that different woods produced different results. Ash provided flexibility that allowed for longer use without fatigue. Oak offered durability, but could become slippery when wet with blood. Birch gave the optimal balance between weight and control, allowing the user to maintain precise aim even during extended sessions of self-flagellation. Many handles were carved with religious symbols or inscribed with Latin phrases. Pax vobiscum, Agnus Dei, miserere mei, transforming these instruments of pain into objects of devotion. The handle of the specimen before us bears the words Pro peccatis nostris, carved in careful Gothic letters, for our sins. But the true engineering marvels were the striking elements themselves. The leather thongs, typically 3 to 7 per flagrum, were crafted from specially treated cowhide that would remain flexible even when repeatedly soaked in blood. The tanning process used extra quantities of oak bark to ensure the leather would not rot or weaken despite constant moisture and abrasion. Regional variations in flagrum design reveal the disturbing extent to which medieval communities refined these tools. Italian examples often featured chains rather than leather, with small metal beads or spikes welded at regular intervals. These produced more consistent lacerations, but were harder to clean and maintain. German craftsmen preferred leather embedded with iron, fragments, small pieces of metal sewn into the thongs that would catch and tear flesh with each strike. The most sophisticated examples, found primarily in French monasteries, incorporated what can only be described as adjustable cruelty. These flagra featured removable elements that could be switched out depending on the severity of penance required. Smooth leather for beginners, studded leather for the experienced, and metal-reinforced thongs for those seeking the most extreme forms of spiritual purification. What we have in our archives are not just the implements themselves, but the instructional texts that accompanied them. These documents treatises on the proper use of flagellation equipment read like engineering, manuals written by men who had lost all perspective on the line between devotion and pathology. One such text, written by an anonymous Franciscan monk sometime in the 1340s, provides detailed specifications for flagrum construction. The author recommends that the thong should be of sufficient length to strike the shoulders and upper back, but not so long as to wrap around the torso and strike the chest or abdomen, as this may damage vital organs and prevent the penitent from completing their prescribed devotions. Another manual, discovered in a German monastery, includes detailed drawings showing the optimal angle of strike for different spiritual objectives. 45 degrees for general contrition, 60 degrees for specific sins requiring special attention, 90 degrees striking straight down for cases of extreme spiritual emergency. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these technological innovations was the systematic approach taken to the problem of durability. Medieval flagellants understood that their implements needed to withstand repeated use over extended periods. A flagrum that broke during a crucial moment of spiritual purification was not just inconvenient, it was potentially catastrophic for the soul's salvation. This led to the development of what can only be called quality control measures. Monastic workshops tested their flagra by striking them against leather-wrapped logs until they showed signs of wear. They developed standardized maintenance procedures involving oil treatments for leather thongs and rust prevention for metal elements. Some monasteries even established schedules for flagrum replacement, treating these instruments with the same systematic care that a carpenter might apply to his tools. The regional specialization that developed around flagrum production reveals how deeply this technology became embedded in medieval economic and social structures. Certain monasteries became known for producing superior scourges, their workshops developing techniques and materials that were closely guarded trade secrets. The monastery of Saint Denis in France was renowned throughout Europe for flagra that would remain effective after years of use. German workshops in the Rhineland developed techniques for creating leather that would not crack or stiffen even in extreme cold, allowing for year-round flagellation. Some of these specialized producers even developed what we might recognize today as product lines. Basic flagra for ordinary penitents, premium models for serious practitioners, and custom designs for specific spiritual requirements. The archives contain correspondence between monasteries discussing the merits of different flagellum styles with the same technical precision that merchants might apply to discussions of cloth or metalwork. But the true technological sophistication of the flagrum is revealed when we examine the medical knowledge that informed its design. Medieval practitioners understood that effective flagellation required careful attention to human anatomy. Strike too high, and you might damage the neck or skull. Too low, and you risked injury to the kidneys or spine. The optimal target zone, the upper back and shoulders, provided maximum pain with minimum risk of permanent disability. This knowledge was systematized into detailed anatomical guides that accompanied flagellation manuals. These texts, written in Latin and illustrated with careful drawings, show the human back divided into zones with different spiritual and medical significance. Certain areas were designated for specific sins, others for particular seasons of the liturgical year. The manuscript collection includes one particularly comprehensive guide, produced at the monastery of Cluny, that divides the back into a grid system. Each square of the grid corresponds to different categories of transgression, creating a kind of spiritual map of the human body. The author provides detailed instructions for targeting specific areas based on the penitent's confession, turning the back into a canvas for theological expression through systematic laceration. What makes these technological innovations so disturbing is not just their sophistication, but the casual way in which extreme cruelty was systematized and refined. The men who designed these improved flagellation techniques were not sadists or madmen. They were skilled craftsmen and learned theologians who genuinely believed they were advancing human spiritual development through the application of engineering principles to the problem of suffering. They approached the infliction of pain with the same methodical care that their contemporaries applied to cathedral construction or manuscript illumination. They tested materials, refined techniques, and documented their innovations with the pride of artisans who had mastered a difficult craft. The economic aspects of flagrum production reveal yet another layer of medieval societies: integration of systematic self-torture into everyday life. Account books from various monasteries show regular expenditures for flagellation equipment, listed alongside purchases of candles, ink, and parchment as routine operational expenses. Some institutions maintained relationships with specific craftsmen who specialized in religious implements, commissioning new flagra on regular schedules, just as they might order new altar cloths or liturgical vessels. The monastery of St. Gall maintained particularly detailed records that include not just purchase prices for flagellation equipment, but maintenance costs, replacement schedules, and even performance evaluations of different suppliers. These documents read like modern procurement files, complete with cost-benefit analyses of various flagrum designs and vendor comparisons based on durability and effectiveness ratings. Perhaps most tellingly, the archives contain evidence that some monasteries actually profited from flagrum production, selling surplus instruments to other religious communities and even to lay flagellant groups. The monastery of Melk in Austria maintained what appears to have been a thriving business in specialized flagellation equipment, with customers throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Their product catalog, yes. They actually produced a catalog lists dozens of different flagrum variations with detailed descriptions and pricing. Basic leather scourges cost the equivalent of a day's wages for a skilled craftsman. Premium models with metal reinforcement cost significantly more. Custom flagra, designed for specific spiritual requirements, commanded premium prices that put them beyond the reach of ordinary penitents. The technology of the flagrum also reveals the global connections of medieval Europe in ways that standard histories often overlook. The iron used in German flagellation equipment came from mines in Styria. The leather was often imported from Spain, where Moorish tanning techniques produced superior results. The chains used in Italian flagra were frequently manufactured in Venice, using techniques learned from Byzantine craftsmen. This international trade in flagellation technology created networks of commerce that connected monasteries across Europe in the shared enterprise of perfecting suffering. Correspondence between religious houses includes technical discussions of flagrum, designed with the same scholarly seriousness that other letters might devote to theological doctrine or architectural planning. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the flagram's technological development was its eventual standardization. By the early 14th century, church authorities had begun to establish official specifications for flagellation equipment, concerned that inferior instruments might compromise the spiritual effectiveness of penitential practices. These standards, preserved in ecclesiastical archives, read like modern industrial specifications. They dictate precise measurements for thong length, handle diameter, and striking weight. They establish quality control procedures for leather treatment and metal incorporation. They even include testing protocols to ensure that flagra meet minimum performance standards before being approved for religious use. The Synod of Wurzburg in 1287 issued a decree requiring that all flagellation equipment used in religious contexts conform to approved specifications. Non-compliant flagra were to be confiscated and destroyed, their users subject to ecclesiastical discipline for using substandard instruments of spiritual purification. What emerges from these documents is a picture of a civilization that had not only accepted systematic self-torture as spiritually beneficial, but had created an entire industry around perfecting the technology required to make such practices safe, efficient, and effective. The flagrum represents the intersection of medieval engineering, theology, and commerce in service of an ideal that modern minds find almost incomprehensible. These were not the products of individual madness, but of collective technological effort directed toward the systematic optimization of human suffering. The men who designed, manufactured, and refined these instruments were applying the same intellectual rigor to the problem of spiritual purification, through pain that their contemporaries applied to agricultural improvement or military engineering. The decline of flagrum technology came not through any sudden recognition of its horror, but through the same gradual process that rendered obsolete so many other medieval innovations. Church authorities began to discourage extreme forms of self-flagellation, not because they recognized it as barbaric, but because it had become associated with heretical movements and challenges to ecclesiastical authority. By the 15th century, flagellation had largely retreated from public practice back into the privacy of monasteries and individual devotion. The sophisticated workshops that had once produced premium flagra for international markets gradually shifted their attention to other forms of religious metalwork and leather crafting. The last known commercial flagra manufacturer ceased operations in Bavaria in 1456, when the monastery of Wessobrunn closed its workshop after centuries of production. The final entry in their account books records the sale of remaining inventory to a private collector, noting with apparent sadness that there is no longer sufficient demand for these instruments of holy discipline to sustain their manufacture. And so we conclude our examination of the flagrum, technological achievement that represents both human ingenuity and human folly in equal measure. These instruments, crafted with such care and refined with such precision, stand as monuments to our species' remarkable ability to systematize even the most questionable practices and to apply sophisticated engineering solutions to problems that perhaps should never have been defined as problems in the first place. What remains, preserved here in our archive, are these silent witnesses to an age when the perfection of suffering was considered a worthy technological goal, pursued with the same dedication that other eras have applied to the perfection of beauty, comfort, or understanding. But our investigation into this medieval mania is not yet complete. The movement that produced mass hysteria, individual delusion, and technological innovation also generated practices and beliefs that would seem strange even by the standards of an already strange time. Let us turn now to our final specimen, filed in the deepest vaults of the archive, where the most peculiar human customs await our examination. Case File 4, the Hindsight File, the ancient practice of sin-eating. We arrive now at the most secluded wing of our collection, the vault where we preserve specimens of human behavior, so strange that even their contemporary practitioners seemed uncomfortable discussing them in detail. Here, in climate-controlled cases. We keep fragments of practices that existed at the very edges of medieval consciousness, traditions so peculiar that they survived primarily through whispered references and hurried marginalia in otherwise conventional texts. Tonight, I invite you to examine what may be the most quietly disturbing custom documented in our entire collection, the practice of sin eating, a ritual that reveals humanity's endless capacity for finding elaborate solutions to spiritual problems that perhaps required no solution at all. This particular specimen comes to us from the Welsh borderlands, though similar practices have been documented across medieval Europe, wherever Celtic traditions merged uneasily with Christian doctrine. The sin-eater Pechadur Buddha in the Welsh tongue occupied a unique and troubling position in medieval society, simultaneously essential and reviled, sought after and shunned, performing a service that everyone needed but no one wanted to acknowledge. The basic concept, described in surviving parish records with obvious reluctance, was disarmingly simple. When a person died, particularly someone whose life had been marked by significant transgressions, a sin-eater would be summoned to perform a ritual that would cleanse the deceased soul by literally consuming their accumulated guilt. The sins of the dead, according to this tradition, could be transferred to the living through the consumption of specific foods eaten over the corpse, thereby ensuring the departed's safe passage to the afterlife, while condemning the sin-eater to bear their moral burden. What makes this practice particularly fascinating for our collection is how it represents a convergence of several distinctly human tendencies: the desire to help the dead, the fear of spiritual contamination, the willingness to sacrifice outcasts for communal benefit, and the persistent belief that complex spiritual problems can be solved through simple physical actions. The earliest documented reference to sin eating in our archives comes from a parish register in Herefordshire, dated 1372. The entry, written in abbreviated Latin by a priest who clearly wished the whole business would simply disappear, records payment of 2 pence to quidem homo peccata commodens pro anima defuncti, literally, a certain man eating sins for the soul of the deceased. But to understand how this extraordinary practice developed, we must first appreciate the spiritual anxiety that pervaded medieval death customs. The Catholic doctrine of purgatory, while offering hope for eventual salvation, also created profound uncertainty about the fate of souls who died before completing adequate penance for their sins. Families faced the terrifying possibility that their loved ones might spend centuries or millennia in purgatorial suffering, or worse, might be condemned to eternal damnation for unconfessed or unabsolved transgressions. Into this void of spiritual uncertainty stepped the sin-eater, offering a service that was both deeply comforting and profoundly disturbing. These individuals, and they were almost exclusively men, occupied the lowest rungs of medieval society. Many were vagabonds or social outcasts who had little left to lose. Others were men so ground down by poverty or misfortune that they were willing to accept spiritual damnation in exchange for a few coins and a meal. The ritual itself varied considerably across different regions, but the basic elements remained consistent throughout our documented cases. When a person of questionable spiritual standing died, the family would secretly approach a known sin-eater, usually through intermediaries who could maintain plausible deniability about the transaction. Negotiations would be conducted in whispers, often in alehouses or other locations removed from church oversight. The fee was typically modest, a few pence, sometimes supplemented with clothing or other necessities. But the real payment was the meal itself, which carried profound symbolic significance. The sin-eater would be provided with bread, beer, or ale, and sometimes additional foods that held special meaning in Celtic tradition. Salt was often included, representing the preservation of the soul. Honey might be added for sweetness in the afterlife. Eggs symbolized rebirth and resurrection. On the appointed night, usually after the official church funeral had concluded, the sin-eater would arrive at the deceased's home. He would position himself beside the corpse, often kneeling or sitting directly adjacent to the body, and begin the solemn business of consuming the ritual meal. As he ate, he would recite specific formulas, part prayer, part incantation, that transferred the dead person's sins to himself. One such formula, preserved in a manuscript discovered in a ruined Welsh chapel, translates roughly as, "I take upon myself the sins of this departed soul. May God forgive them through my consumption, and may their spirit find peace through my burden. What they have done, I now carry. What they have suffered, I now embrace. In bread and ale, their guilt becomes mine." The psychological impact of such rituals on both families and sin-eaters must have been profound. For the bereaved, it offered a kind of spiritual insurance policy, a final guarantee that their loved one's soul would not be lost to eternal punishment. The sin-eater provided tangible, immediate action in the face of metaphysical uncertainty, transforming abstract theological anxiety into a concrete transaction that could be completed and paid for. But for the sin-eaters themselves, the practice represented a form of spiritual martyrdom that slowly accumulated over years of service. Each ritual added new sins to their personal burden, creating individuals who were, according to the logic of their own profession, among the most damned souls in Christendom. What emerges from our archival research is a picture of men who were simultaneously essential to their communities and completely excluded from them. Sin-eaters were called upon when needed, but shunned at all other times. They were not welcome in churches, taverns, or any place where respectable people gathered. They lived on the margins of medieval society, carrying not just their own sins, but the accumulated guilt of everyone they had served. Some records suggest that sin-eaters developed their own informal communities, gathering together in remote locations where they could share the psychological burden of their profession. These gatherings, described in fragmentary accounts by hostile observers, involved their own rituals and traditions, methods for coping with the spiritual weight they carried, and techniques for finding some measure of peace, despite their self-imposed damnation. The practice of sin-eating also reveals the complex relationship between official church doctrine and popular religious belief in medieval Europe. While Catholic theology provided no support for the notion that sins could be transferred through ritual consumption, and while church authorities occasionally condemned the practice when they encountered it, many priests and bishops chose to look the other way when confronted with sin-eating in their jurisdictions. This tacit acceptance suggests that even learned clerics recognized the genuine spiritual need that sin-eating addressed. In a world where sudden death was common and formal confession was not always possible, the practice provided a safety valve for religious anxiety that might otherwise have led to more serious challenges to church authority. Some of our most detailed accounts of sin-eating come from the journals of traveling missionaries who encountered the practice in remote areas and were simultaneously horrified and fascinated by its persistence. Brother Thomas of Monmouth, writing in the late 14th century, described witnessing a sin-eating ritual in a Welsh mountain village. The man who came to perform this awful office was ancient beyond measure, bent with years, and weighted with the sins of countless souls. He moved like one already dead, his eyes holding depths of sorrow that seemed to encompass all human suffering. As he ate the bread and drank the ale, he wept not from grief, I think, but from the terrible knowledge of what he was taking upon himself. When the ritual was complete, the family gave him his fee and hurried him from their home, as if his very presence might contaminate their relief. The economic aspects of sin-eating reveal yet another layer of medieval society's complex relationship with spiritual commerce. Unlike other religious services, sin-eating operated entirely outside official church structures, creating a shadow economy of salvation that bypassed traditional ecclesiastical authority. Sin-eaters set their own fees, negotiated their own terms, and provided their services without oversight or regulation. This independence made them potentially dangerous to established religious order, but also made them nearly impossible to eliminate. As long as people feared for the spiritual welfare of their deceased loved ones, there would be demand for sin-eating services, regardless of official condemnation or social stigma. Regional variations in sin-eating practices reveal how different communities adapted the basic concept to local traditions and needs. In some Welsh communities, sin-eaters were required to consume their ritual meal using the deceased's own plate and cup, which were then broken and buried with the body. In Scottish border regions, the practice incorporated elements of clan loyalty, with sin-eaters sometimes specializing in serving particular family groups across multiple generations. Irish variants of the custom sometimes involved multiple sin-eaters working in concert, each taking responsibility for different categories of sin. One might consume the deceased's sins of the flesh, another their sins of greed or pride, creating a kind of spiritual division of labor that distributed the spiritual burden while theoretically increasing the ritual's effectiveness. The decline of sin-eating came not through any sudden recognition of its theological problems, but through the same gradual process of social modernization that eliminated many other medieval customs. As literacy increased and formal education spread, the elaborate theological justifications for sin-eating became harder to maintain. Protestant reforms, with their emphasis on direct relationship with God and rejection of ritual intermediation, found sin-eating particularly objectionable. But perhaps most importantly, changes in death customs themselves reduced the demand for sin-eating services. As formal confession became more common and accessible, as extreme unction became more widely available, as the doctrine of purgatory was refined and explained more clearly, the desperate spiritual anxiety that had created demand for sin-eaters gradually diminished. The last documented sin-eater in Britain operated in the Welsh mountains as late as the 17th century, according to records kept by local magistrates, who seemed uncertain whether to prosecute him for fraud or pity him for his delusions. By that time, he was apparently the sole practitioner of an art that had once sustained communities of spiritual outcasts across medieval Europe. What makes sin-eating particularly poignant for our collection is how clearly it illustrates humanity's willingness to sacrifice individuals for collective peace of mind. The families who employed sin-eaters were not cruel or callous. They were desperate people seeking spiritual comfort in the face of mortality's uncertainties. But they were willing to purchase that comfort at the cost of another person's eternal damnation, creating a class of spiritual scapegoats who absorbed society's religious anxieties along with its accumulated guilt. The sin-eater represents one of humanity's most peculiar solutions to the problem of moral responsibility, the notion that guilt can be transferred like a commodity, bought and sold like any other service. It reveals both our deep need to believe that past wrongs can be undone and our disturbing willingness to purchase absolution through the suffering of others. In the end, the practice of sin-eating stands as a monument to the lengths humans will go to avoid confronting the possibility that some spiritual problems simply cannot be solved through ritual action, that some guilt must be borne by those who incurred it, and that the comfort of the living cannot always be purchased through the damnation of the desperate. And so we close our final case file, having examined the strange mania of flagellant cults through 4 distinct lenses: the mass delusion that swept across plague-ravaged Europe, the personal folly of individuals who mistook spiritual intensity for divine election, the technological sophistication applied to the perfection of suffering, and the peculiar custom that promised to solve death's spiritual problems through ritual consumption. Each specimen in our collection illuminates a different aspect of the same fundamental human tendency, the desire to find concrete, actionable solutions to abstract spiritual anxieties. Whether through public self-flagellation, claims of personal divinity, perfected instruments of torture, or the literal consumption of guilt, medieval society created elaborate mechanisms for addressing fears and uncertainties that perhaps required no solution beyond acceptance and faith. What connects all these practices is their common assumption that extreme measures are sometimes necessary, that ordinary devotion is insufficient for extraordinary times, and that the most complex spiritual problems can be solved through the most dramatic physical actions. Let us now ascend from these vaults and return to the present moment, carrying with us the knowledge that human folly, while taking different forms across the centuries, springs from needs and fears that remain remarkably constant: the desire for certainty in an uncertain world, the search for meaning in the face of suffering, and the persistent belief that if we just try hard enough, we can find ways to control forces that may be fundamentally beyond human control. Reflection. And so we close the folio on medieval Europe's flagellant mania, returning these documents and artifacts to their protective cases where they will wait, patient and silent, for the next curious soul who seeks to understand how civilized people can convince themselves to embrace the most uncivilized behaviors. What have we learned from this evening's exploration? That the human capacity for well-intentioned error is both boundless and remarkably consistent across time. The flagellants who scourged themselves in 14th century town squares were not fundamentally different from modern movements that promise salvation through extreme measures. The individuals who declared themselves divine messengers were driven by the same psychological forces that create charismatic leaders in every age. The craftsmen who perfected instruments of torture were applying human ingenuity to solve problems that their society had defined as important, regardless of how those definitions might appear to later observers. Perhaps most importantly, we have seen how societies under extreme stress can normalize the most extraordinary behaviors. The Black Death created conditions where public self-torture seemed reasonable, where claims of divine revelation found eager audiences, where the systematic perfection of suffering appeared to be legitimate technological progress, and where purchasing spiritual peace through another person's damnation felt like practical necessity. These were not failures of intelligence, but failures of perspective, inability to step back from immediate circumstances and ask whether the solutions being pursued were proportionate to the problems being addressed. The flagellants and their contemporaries were trapped within worldviews that made their extreme behaviors seem not just reasonable, but necessary. And what of our own time? What behaviors that seem perfectly reasonable to us might appear as specimens of spectacular delusion to future archivists examining the follies of the early 21st century? What problems are we solving with such elaborate ingenuity that we have forgotten to ask whether they needed solving at all? What extreme measures are we normalizing in response to our own versions of existential crisis? The beauty of the archive is that it offers no easy answers to such questions, only the gentle reminder that every generation believes itself wiser than its predecessors, and every generation is eventually proven wrong in ways it could never have anticipated. For now, though, leave these troubling questions here among the manuscripts and artifacts where they belong. The follies of the past are safely contained within these walls, their power to harm diminished by time and understanding. The night is growing late, and the present moment calls us back to simpler concerns: rest, peace, the quiet satisfaction of having glimpsed, however briefly, the vast tapestry of human experience in all its bewildering complexity. The flagellant scourge has crumbled to dust. Konrad Schmid's divine claims have been reduced to footnotes in obscure scholarly journals. The sin-eaters have eaten their last ritual meal. But the human heart that created all these elaborate solutions to spiritual anxiety, that heart beats on, in you, in me, in every soul that seeks meaning in an often meaningless world. Sleep well, knowing that whatever follies our age may be committing, they are part of an ancient and honorable tradition of humanity, doing its very best with insufficient information and too much fear. In the morning, we will face our own uncertainties with whatever wisdom we can muster, grateful that we live in times when the search for spiritual peace rarely requires quite so much blood. And if you find that sleep comes slowly, remember that these stories of medieval madness are now safely locked away in the archive, where they can do no harm except to remind us that human folly, while persistent, is also survivable. Civilizations endure, wisdom accumulates slowly, and eventually, even the most spectacular delusions fade into the quiet dignity of historical curiosity. Until we meet again in these halls of memory, rest easy in the knowledge that the strangest chapters of human behavior are behind us now, preserved in ink and parchment, and fading into the gentle silence of the past.